It's no secret that I have had some spectacular garden failures over the years. And if you followed me for any length of time, you've probably seen me tell those stories. I've had incredibly devastating hailstorms just wipe out my whole garden. We've dealt with persistent herbicide damage not once, but twice. And last year, I ended up with a number of bags of bad potting soil that, little did I know, didn't have enough nitrogen in them, and they killed over 100 of my tomato and pepper seedlings. So I am no stranger to garden mishaps, but I think one of the biggest issues and struggles that I've had over the years that maybe I don't talk about as much just because it's not as spectacular and sensational is our climate. So we live on the High Plains Prairie in southeast Wyoming, and it is uniquely challenging to garden here. Um, Even more so, the little pocket of area where we live is harsher than areas even just 40, 50 miles north or south of us. So at the beginning, it was such a struggle that I honestly wondered if I even could garden. And I actually had people tell me it wasn't possible here. And I know that's not true, obviously, because I've grown many, many gardens since then. But every year, our climate presents a unique challenge to me. And I'm always just trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. Now, over the years, my perspective of our climate has changed a lot. And honestly, I've learned to appreciate it more than I used to, thanks to primarily a number of conversations I've had with the wonderful guests here on the podcast. And that has caused me to really embrace what I believe to be one of the most underrated garden principles out there. And that's what I want to dive into today. It's spring for most of us in the northern hemisphere. You either have your garden planted or you're getting ready to. And I want to give you a little bit of inspiration and hopefully a little bit of a perspective shift as we roll into the craziness of the summer garden. So let's do this. Welcome to Old Fashioned on Purpose, the show where we explore what we have left behind as we have raced towards progress and how we can get the good stuff back. I'm your host, Jill Winger. I have been living this homesteading lifestyle out here on the Wyoming prairie since 2008. I love it so much, and I love teaching these principles to folks like you. So some of you have heard this story, I think. Oh, I know where it was. I wrote about it in Old Fashioned on Purpose. But early on in our journey, we had bought our property here, and we were determined to plant trees. And I had been reading some of the homesteading books that were on the market at the time. I think the first book I ever got was The Backyard Homestead by Carleen Madigan. And that's kind of become a favorite and a classic. And it's not a deep dive book, but it just kind of highlights a little bit of everything. But she had a lot of, I remember her drawings of what a homestead could look like. And there were orchards and hog pens and chicken coops and pastures. And she had it so beautifully drawn out in such a efficient way. And it just totally captured my imagination. And then each chapter, she just did a kind of a surface level explanation of different aspects of homesteading. And I was just so enamored with that book. And I was like, well, if I'm going to have a homestead, I want it to look like this. And I would just pour over those sketches and think, okay, I have to have this, 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 this. It was like a recipe for the perfect homestead. And one thing that always came up in these lists of the perfect homestead was having an orchard. So naturally, I'm like, I got to start an orchard. They take a long time to develop and, we need to get going ASAP. So one Saturday, Christian and I drove down to northern Colorado. We're not too far from there. There's some great nurseries, and we purchased some ash trees for our yard, and then I wanted a whole bunch of fruit trees. And so I asked the little sales guy there, I'm like, okay, I live in a pretty harsh climate. I live, in Wyoming. It's different than you guys. So will these trees work for me? And there was, I think, an apple and some pears is what I was looking at. And he's like, yeah. They need to have some windbreak, but you're not that different from us in terms of weather patterns, so you should be fine. So I listened to him. I think we brought home 4 or 5 trees, a couple apple, couple pears, and I planted them in a moderately decently protected area where the wind wasn't just going to whip them to death. And, I had kind of heard other people say that you couldn't grow fruit trees here. And I'm like, you know what? I am pretty stubborn and I'm pretty determined and I make things happen. So I'm going to make these trees grow. Well, you guys know what happened, right? If you read the book, You can't force trees to grow where they don't want to grow, no matter how gritty and determined you may be. And guys, I tried. Like, I fertilized them. I even bought like the chemical fruit tree stuff that I didn't love, but I'm like, hey, I'm going to do what it takes to make sure these trees grow and they don't get bugs or whatever. Um, and I think two of the pears and one of the apples just died like immediately. I put them in the ground and they lasted a couple months and then they're like, this is not for us. We are not supposed to be here. There was one single solitary apple tree that lived through the first winter and it lived into the next summer and it had leaves and I was so excited and I was just like baby it and watch it and weed around it and spray it and do all the things I was supposed to do. It produced the tiniest little apple, like it was about the size of a quarter. So it gave me an apple. I remember one year our drifts, you've probably seen my pictures of our giant snow drifts and like they can be 5-6 feet tall. A drift drifted on top of the apple tree just with how it was positioned in the yard. And I went out after the storm finished and dug it out so the weight of the melting snow wouldn't break all the branches. So I was like digging on my hands and knees around this little tree. I was like, this tree will live. Well, it finally gave up the ghost about 3 years in, but I will give it credit for trying. But anyway, after that happened, and granted, this tree had lived that long, but it had never grown. It looked the same. It was the exact same size it was the day I brought it home from the nursery. After that experience, I'm like, I'm done. There will be no orchard. And I declared, fruit trees don't grow in Wyoming. And so I kind of shifted my sights elsewhere. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with Bob Osborne here on the podcast. The episode is season 9, episode 3, and it's called Can You Grow Apples in the Arctic? And I kind of went into that interview expecting to gather information for you guys, for those of you who don't live in the Arctic. And I really didn't expect him to have much advice for me. And I expected, if I asked him about apples, growing in my climate, he'd go, yeah, that's not possible. Well, he actually surprised me when I asked him if it was possible for someone like me to grow apples in my area. And he's like, oh, absolutely, of course. And he proceeded to explain, go back and listen to the episode. It's fantastic. He proceeded to explain all the different varieties. And I didn't realize there was so much variety, not just in color or crispness or sweet or sour, but just certain varieties that are able to grow in extremely cold temperatures. They're able to handle less water. They're able to handle much deeper freezes. And so thank you, Bob, because you got my wheels turning and he really opened up a whole new realm of possibilities for me. So not only did I start to realize that maybe some fruit growing was possible for me, but it also really underscored and kind of first introduced this principle to my mind. And this is what I'm calling the most underrated principle because I think so often in this homestead world, this home food production world, we get this idea of what the perfect homestead has to look like. Just like me, when I was looking back at that book, I had this list of this needs to be checked off. I do love a checklist, y'all. I really do. So I had this checklist of this has to be checked off. This has to be checked off. And A plus B equals C, and then I'll have the homestead. And so sometimes we do that just within our gardens. We think that we have to grow this certain set of vegetables in order for it to count as a real garden. And again, I think I've led up to this. I haven't actually said it yet. This underrated garden principle, I'm sorry to make you wait, is, drumroll please, grow what wants to grow where you live. Grow what wants to grow where you live. And I know some of you are going, wow, Jill, that's revolutionary. And you're about ready to shut off the show because it feels so obvious. But hold on, because that's not as obvious as you may think, right? It certainly wasn't obvious for me. And I think this kind of comes back into a little bit of a permaculture philosophy where we really start to ask ourselves, how can we partner with nature? How can we partner with our land, even if our land is a backyard? How can we partner with our climate for optimal food production instead of making nature bend under our boot? And that's a little bit what I was trying to do unintentionally with my fruit tree escapade all those years ago, is I was trying to force it to happen. And the cool thing about nature is it will teach you real quick. You can't force it. You have to work with it. Now, humans try to force it, but when we do, the results aren't great. And when we partner with nature on our homesteads, and this might feel, again, it feels obvious. You might go, I'm raising chickens. I have tomatoes. I'm already partnering with nature. And yes, friend, you likely are, but I think you can take it. I know I can take it to a deeper level where we're really working in tandem outside with our ground, with our soil, with the creatures, and it's pretty awesome. It makes me really, really excited. And I think this concept is really exciting me more than anything else right now, just to figure out the possibilities of taking it to the next level. Um, I'm going to reference another one of my favorite podcast episodes. This might be my all-time favorite, and I've talked about it so many times. But Mr. Rob Avis, season 12, episode 1, it's called "The Problem Becomes the Solution." And he introduced this idea of the three mindsets of how humans relate to the world. And you can see these mindsets, especially the first two, reflected in different political parties, right? So he explained, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, he put it more eloquently than I will. But the first perspective or mindset that we see that's very pervasive in our culture is this idea that we are the scourge of the earth, that humans are scum, that humans shouldn't be here, that it'd be better if we just kind of dwindled our population down to nothing and let nature, let the earth do what it wants to do without us, right? We hear that a lot, especially right now. It's very loud in certain circles. So that's perspective number one. Perspective number two of how humans relate with nature is really the opposite. It's that we are the masters of the earth, that we are here to dominate and have dominion. And that means that we can pillage and destroy anything we want for our good and our benefit. And that's just the way it is. And we can see that mentality reflected in sometimes how corporations move through the world, where they're only motivated by profits instead of partnership with nature. Okay. So those are the two big ideologies that are a little bit at war right now in political circles, in the media, and sometimes just in communities. But Rob, in that episode, presented a third option. And I remember the minute he said it, I just got chills because he explained that truly what we're designed to do is partner with nature. Humans are a part of nature. We're not this scab. We're not this parasite, even though sometimes we're told that we are. But we can partner with nature to help it, to preserve it, to improve it. And I really see us as homesteaders or gardeners or whatever title you want to use to describe your old-fashioned life. We have such a beautiful and unique opportunity to do that. And so ever since I've had those conversations with Rob and Bob, I think about that every time I'm out in the garden, every time I'm buying a plant, every time I'm shopping for seeds. And it's really shifted the way that I garden and the way that I homestead. I'm interrupting this episode for just a second to tell you about a homesteading event that may be near you. And if it is, you definitely gotta go. It's the second annual Modern Homestead Conference in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And before I tell you more, I have some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that I can't attend, and I am so bummed. I just couldn't make the dates work this year. But the good news is there are a ton of other amazing speakers and experts that you are going to learn so much from. Joel Salatin will be there. Lisa from Farmhouse on Boone, she's been here on my podcast. Homesteading Family, Sally Fallon, Jess from Roots and Refuge, and tons more. They'll also have Dr. Temple Grandin doing a very special talk this year. I got to see her last year, and she was amazing. So this 2-day event features presentations for both beginner and advanced homesteaders. There's topics like food preservation, seed saving, animal husbandry and processing, fire and homestead preparedness, herbalism, how to build a strong community, and that is just scratching the surface. So if you've never attended an event like this, trust me, it's really worth it to make some time and go. You're going to see these things in real life, in person, which will fast track your learning so much more. Plus, there's just nothing like getting to rub shoulders with people who are like-minded and doing all the weird and crazy things that you and I like to do. So get your tickets now. They're still for sale, and you can grab them over at modernhomesteading.com. So, what does this look like? You might ask. So, again, the first piece of this for me is just asking myself that question when it comes to the garden: what wants to grow here? Instead of trying to force peaches and pears to grow here, I started to look at what fruit grows naturally in my area or what fruit grows naturally in similar climates, right? So for me, that is currants, buffalo berries, native plums, some apple trees you'll see along different creeks or in different properties. Rhubarb is a big one. It's not native, but if you go to any of the old homesteads, you will see crazy big rhubarb plants growing out of control. It wants to live here. And so looking back at some of those old homesteads is a great clue. I see a lot of them have currants planted, they have rhubarb planted. Even though those homesteads, many of them have been left to ruin, those plants still survive. And you can even find some apple trees in that same realm. So I'm like, okay, that's a good clue. If the old timers planted those without sprinkler systems and without fancy fertilizers and chemicals to prop them up, odds are that those plants are easy to grow in my climate. So there's kind of a two-pronged thing here. It's identifying what wants to grow in your climate, but then also letting go of our expectations and letting go of this idea that we literally have to grow a grocery store, because we do not. It is a modern idea that we think we must have all manner of fruit or all manner of food available to us at all times. It's a nice convenience, but it's not a necessity. And so I think if we can not only get more cozy with native species, but also just let go of that expectation on multiple fronts, that's going to go a long way. Now, that doesn't mean that I never grow anything that's not native, right? So I still am growing things like tomatoes and cucumbers and potatoes. Those don't grow naturally in my area, and they probably don't grow natively in your area either. But I just know that as I'm growing those things, I know that they're going to take a little bit more effort than something that wants to grow here. And so I either will reduce my expectations or reduce the crop that I expect to get to match how difficult it may be to grow in my area. Sometimes that even takes us out of the realm of just gardens and produce and helps us look at things across the entire board of personal food production. So we live on the High Plains Prairie. We are a grassland. We were bison central back in the day. I'm in an area where we have these big bluffs or cliffs, and that was where the Native Americans would drive the buffalo off the cliff. Like, we were all buffalo. So what does that mean for my growing? That means trees don't really like it here, really trees of any kind. Um, there is a ton of diversity in grassland species, but there's not a lot of fruit things. So I live on the High Plains Prairie. That means I am a grassland. We were bison central back in the day. So that means what really loves to grow here are large ruminants, not tomatoes. And that's not to say that I won't still try to grow tomatoes, but when I look at the bang for my buck that I get in the inputs I put into raising a steer versus trying to raise, 200 pounds of tomatoes, it's easier to raise the steer for me. That might not be the case for you, right? If you live on a mountainous, rocky homestead, it might take a ton of effort to grow that steer because you don't have a lot of grass. You're having to haul in hay. And hay is expensive, and then you have fuel. So it's not to say you shouldn't raise beef, but it just might take more effort. But for me, beef is easy. Produce is not as easy. And so that's why we've really focused on the beef, so much so that we now, raise it commercially and ship it around to many of you, our grass-finished Wyoming beef. But I'm not trying to do a farmer's market business on tomatoes and cucumbers, because some years they're good, some years they're not, some years they're frustrating, some years they're okay. And that would be a recipe for pulling my hair out. Another thing to consider, even just within deciding what you're growing, is really, really look at the varieties, especially if you're in a challenging climate like I am. And this is where Bob Osborne really expanded my horizons. And all apple trees are not created equal. You're going to get a ton of variation, and that's true across so many different plants. I'm talking raspberries, blueberries, tomatoes, cucumbers. When I am ordering seeds, I am looking at those descriptions and the time frame that it takes to maturity for each of those plants. And I'm always getting something that is short and quick. You may not have that same consideration. You might need to find things that are more hardy for heat or more hardy for high elevation. I mean, it just really depends. But if you look outside of the main kind of beaten path of where you buy plants or where you buy seeds, odds are you're going to find some heirloom or some heritage varieties that are going to be a little better suited for you and your unique climate versus just mass production. I want to give a shout out to St. Lawrence Nursery. They are not sponsoring this. I don't know I'm going to mention them today, but I was so thrilled when I found them because they specialize in fruit trees and bushes and shrubs that are extremely cold hardy. And they have fruits that I never thought I could even grow that are so well suited for us. I've been purchasing from them for a couple years, and I have one of their pear trees that's growing like gangbusters out in my yard. I have apple trees that can survive from fall through spring with minimal water and really nasty temperatures, and they come back happily. Like I don't have to beg those plants to grow. And that's a beautiful thing. The same thing with my currants. My currants, when I put them in, if you don't know what a currant is, it's a kind of a bush and a shrub, and they have these little dark purple, black, or red berries on them, and they're a little bit tart. You can make currant jam or currant preserves. So I hadn't really ever thought of currants because we don't really talk about them that much. But when I finally planted them and I saw how much they love to grow here, I'm like, why have I been trying to force these exotic fruits to grow that don't like it in Wyoming? The currants are the first thing to bloom and put leaves on in the spring. They put out a ton of fruit. They're almost like a weed, and they make wonderful jam. So why try to force myself to figure out strawberries? And I still play with strawberries. I'm not against strawberries, but why try to force that when I have a plant that's like begging to grow and I don't even have to babysit it? It really reminds me of another principle that I've been chewing on recently, and I came across it in the book Effortless by Greg McKeown, and he's the one who wrote the Essentialism book. I will say a lot of you I know asked me about my book recommendations. I didn't like Effortless as much as I liked Essentialism, maybe just because some of the stuff felt like I'd already heard it elsewhere. That's not to say you won't love it, but it was a good book, but not like my top favorite in the whole world. Anyway, one of the principles, though, that he did mention in the book that I have been repeating to myself ever since I finished it is the concept of let it be easy. Now, he was referring to that in scheduling our personal lives or our businesses or anywhere we overcomplicate our schedules or our tasks. But it absolutely applies to homesteading as well. And I don't know about you, but I definitely have this tendency to feel like if something isn't hard or a struggle, or if I didn't have to put a lot of sweat into it, that like the result's not going to be worth it. Do you guys ever struggle with that? I think it's more common than we think, and I really hate to admit that. But sometimes we feel if something is too simple or too easy, then we didn't earn the result. And sometimes we'll actually overcomplicate things in order to feel like we put in our sweat equity. Now, don't get me wrong. I love me some hustle. I love some sweat equity. I love doing hard things. But sometimes our brains can actually complicate stuff when it doesn't need to be. And I think this is something that I definitely was doing in my garden. I was trying to force something to grow instead of just finding things that wanted to grow and letting it easy. And we can even take this idea of letting it be easy a step further, not just in the varieties of plants or the types of produce that we're growing, but also just on our homesteads in a bigger realm as well. We can start to think about what does nature want and how does working with nature help us get a better result, not only for ourselves, but also for the ecosystems that we're within. And yes, your backyard or your front yard, if you're in the suburbs or an urban area, still counts as your ecosystem. And really digging into these ideas is made me a huge proponent of mulching my garden, right? Covering that soil, It's helped me to not dig and till my soil as much. I'm not saying I don't do it ever because I'm still trying to get into that transition of being 100% no dig. But, when I started to think, what happens in nature? Does nature flip the soil upside down every year? Well, no. And how could I start to mimic that? Not only am I rototilling less and I'm digging less, which is much easier on me, I'm getting better results. I posted a reel on Instagram, I don't know, a year or two ago, where I was talking about how I planted cover crops and then it was rye and it grew for a while. And then I whacked it down to kill it on purpose, left the roots in the ground, and planted my tomatoes in the decomposing roots. And honestly, when I was doing that, it felt crazy for multiple reasons. But one of the biggest things was like, this feels too easy. I feel like I need to sweat it out and dig up all the root systems before I plant the tomatoes to make it like count. So I'm glad I pushed through those little voices in my head because those tomatoes that grew within that root mass that was decomposing were fantastic. It was one of the best tomato crops I've ever had. And I worked with nature and I let it be easy. So, just some things for you to chew on today as you are out in your garden more, you're out in your homesteads. Think about your systems and processes. And I totally do think this is a step-by-step progression. I don't know if I would say you have to have this mastered. I mean, I don't have it mastered yet. You're not going to have it mastered your first few years of homesteading. Those first few years, you're just trying to get your feet under you, figure out what you can grow, figure out how to keep the chickens or do the sourdough or can the tomatoes or whatever. But as you get comfortable with that, just start seeing where your systems and processes can improve. You can partner with nature more. You can let it be easy and see what happens. Because in my opinion, that's when things start to get super exciting. I have a little free resource for you, just in case you are struggling with some of your organizational garden systems this year. We created the Savvy Seed Tracker because I've had so many folks communicate to me they felt overwhelmed with all of the garden zones and planting dates. And I know that some of you have already planted and you won't need this year, but go ahead and grab it for next year. Plus, we have a tab. It's a spreadsheet, right? This fancy spreadsheet, super fun. We had a blast building it. But there's a tab in there for your seed inventories as well. And you can kind of track how things are growing this year. So go ahead and grab it, even if you've already planted. It's totally free. We're going to drop the link down in the show notes. But I'd love for you to try it and let me know what you think, because I think the more we can get streamlined with our gardens and get a little more objective in how we're planning it out, the better they'll go. So that's all I have for you today, friends. Thanks so much for listening, and I will catch up with you on the next episode of Old Fashioned on Purpose.